We have come to the final plenary session entitled Mobilization of International Assistance and its Effective Use for Sustainable Growth towards a New Aid Paradigm. Once all the presentations have been made, the floor will be open for questions and comments from the audience and from other speakers, to which our speakers will respond. In this regard, each of the speakers will be given the opportunity to speak between 15 to 20 minutes for your time, for your presentation. Our first speaker on the list is Ambassador Macharia Kamau, Permanent Representative of the Republic of Kenya to the United Nations in New York. He was formerly Kenya's PR to UNON, UNEP, and Habitat. In addition to his diplomatic assignments, Ambassador Kamau was an international consultant to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and to UNAIDS. He has vast experience at the UN, where he served for over 25 years, mostly in senior management positions at UNDP, UNICEF, and UNTAC. During this period, he was deployed in various countries in Eastern and Southern Africa, as well as the Caribbean. In addition to that, I would like to also share with you that Ambassador Kamau is currently co-chairing a very important process, Open Working Group on Sustainable Development in New York. And my admiration to you, Ambassador, for the work that you have done. And we are nearly there. We are going to have another last session in July. And I do believe with your expertise and the way you have steered the group so far, we will come to a successful conclusion. With this, we are very pleased to have you with us, Ambassador, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And a very good afternoon to all of you. Let me first of all begin by saying that it's a great honor and pleasure for Kenya to host. I know this has been said already, but I'd like to say it on my own account, this committee, because we believe that the work of this committee is a moral imperative that still remains unresolved. And that the world continues to be blighted by the existence of the situation in Palestine. Ambassador, this afternoon I see here that we are speaking about the mobilization of international assistance and its effective use for sustainable growth. And it says that the discussion should really be looking at the idea as towards a new aid paradigm. One of the interesting things that has come to the fore in the last few years and is going to become very common now is that it's become clear that the old paradigm, the aid-driven paradigm of international assistance has as it were, reached its zenith. I do not believe that there are many people or many countries that still continue to expect that aid, overseas development assistance, as we've known it for the last 50, 60 odd years, is going to be the fundamental driver of development and change, and is going to be the main characteristic of international development relations in the 21st century. If anything, the experience of Asia shows very clearly the limits of the ODA paradigm. East Asia has managed to transform itself in very fundamental ways, not so much by ODA, which had its uses in the 1950s and 60s, but which reached its limits as early as the 1980s and the 1990s. So to speak of a new aid paradigm today is not to speak of something that is unexceptional or new. In fact, it is to recognize what has already been happening in the world over the last 10 or 15 years. In the case of Palestine, of course, we all saw the reports that were given here, and the reports themselves were amazingly demonstrative of a very tragic and sad affair. The situation in Palestine is truly horrific, not so much and not only because of the unnecessary loss of life, but because the situation there blights all sense of hope and human dignity, and in and of itself is characteristic of a way of life that we in the world thought we had put behind us. In the context of the new sustainable development paradigm, which is really what I want to speak to, we in the United Nations and in the context of the intergovernmental process under the Open Working Group of the United Nations General Assembly are beginning to put together a development set of goals that we hope will drive development globally. And some of the principles of that are that development goals have to be universal, they have to be transformative, and they have to have a cross-cutting effect on social, economic, and the political work of nations, but also most importantly on the matters of environment. Now, if you look at the reports that we heard yesterday from many organizations and others who spoke yesterday, including the ambassador of the State of Palestine, clearly the situation in Palestine is really a situation of colonialism, occupation, an apartheid type of political construct that is truly anathema in the 21st century. That we still continue to have these political plagues in now is an amazing thing. The way in which we are characterizing and designing the Sustainable Development Goals is to ensure that not only do we put behind us these outdated ideas of colonialism, occupation, exploitation, apartheid, and so on, but that we put together a set of goals that will radically change opportunities for all human beings everywhere. And again, to take into account what has happened in Europe between the world wars, so, between the 1920s and the 40s, and then again the burst of growth and transformation that happened in Europe between 1950 and, let's say, 2000. Clearly, that burst of growth in Europe demonstrated that societies, economies, and politics can be transformed rapidly in very short periods of time. The Asia experience, as I said earlier, the East Asia experience, demonstrates that not only can it be done rapidly, because in Europe it took almost 70, 80 odd years to see this radical mass transformation of all populations, not just the elite kingdoms and kings and princes, but a mass change in the well-being of all people. In the case of East Asia, we saw this happen in a period of 30 to 40 years. Rapid transformation of countries like Indonesia, China, Japan, Malaysia, Thailand, in ways in which were unimaginable in the 1960s. And this has set the stage for very high expectations of what can happen and what is possible in a world where there is no colonialism, there is no occupation, there is no apartheid, there is no exploitation, in a world where human beings are treating each other in a civilized manner, where poverty is seen as unacceptable, where health and diseases are the diseases are being fought through and fought off, where social inclusion and social harmony is seen as a primary part of what society has to be, and where economic prosperity is seen as the primary driver of change. A world where human rights are protected everywhere. So when we think about Palestine, and when we think about Palestine in the context of the new development paradigm, it cannot be that the situation in Palestine continues the way it has been for the last 30, 40 years. It simply cannot be. It is a fundamental contradiction to what it is that we in the world, we in the international community aspire for. Because now we are aspiring, and if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which we released just the last document just yesterday, if you look at that set of goals, you will see clearly that we have 4 primary things that we're trying to do. The first is to eradicate extreme poverty, literally to end it. Extreme poverty everywhere. And again, a lot of people may say that that is pie in the sky, it's not doable, but these are people who do not know what happened in Europe or what has happened in East Asia, or for that matter, in large parts of Latin America, where in 40 years, societies have been transformed completely, where you had poverty as the mainstay of the economy, and where in 40 years, it's completely transformed. So we expect to be able to do this everywhere. That's the first thing. And in doing so, of course, we have to complete the business of the Millennium Development Goals, and we also have to worry seriously about the state of the earth. So the second thing after poverty is healing the earth. The Industrial Revolution that has now traversed much of the world has left a huge negative environmental imprint, which not only needs to be reversed, but needs to be brought to a halt so that it does not continue into the future. So the challenge of healing the earth is going to be a fundamental thing for the future. We heard yesterday that in the case of Palestine, the damage to the environment because of this Bantu, they're not Bantu stands, but they appear as if they are, this concentration of people onto small plots of land, so that their lives are not only made miserable in the psychological and social sense, but are devastating to the ecology and the environment around them, is simply not acceptable in the kind of future that we want. A future that is embracing of environment, that is green, that is respective of biodiversity, and so on and so forth. So that's a challenge for the situation in Palestine. And it needs to be met, and met forcefully. The third thing I said is the area of social harmony. The future we want, as we have now begun to spell out in the Sustainable Development Goals, is a future of social harmony. It cannot be that people are at war or are being subjugated to oppression and exploitation, or are being colonized, or are being segregated. It simply cannot be. That is not the world we envision in the future that we want. And the Sustainable Development Goals, which I recommend you to read now that they're up on the web, are clear that they spell out goals and targets that envision a very different kind of world. And lastly is economic prosperity. So, 1, we get rid of poverty. 2, we heal the earth and repair what damage we have done. 3, we create better harmony and a more inclusive world. 4, we make sure we have prosperity that's driven by economic transformation that brings everybody along. Nobody is left behind. That's the world that we are aspiring for. We've put together a set of 17 Sustainable Development Goals. A lot of people say, why don't you have 8 like you did with the MDGs? We tell them the MDGs was an old paradigm set of goals. For the old paradigm, the ODA paradigm, the paradigm of handouts, the paradigm of aid. This is a universal transformative paradigm that seeks to see a different future for everybody. And I remember having a conversation in New York recently and using the Palestine example and saying, when we say everybody, we don't mean everybody but the Palestinians. We mean everybody on earth. So, Mr. Chairman, I know my time is out, but I did want to say we do have a new paradigm that is being unfolded. It will be adopted at the General Assembly in September. It will be an aid paradigm that will have a very radical and transformative approach to change and economic growth and social inclusion. It will be a paradigm that will be intolerant of human rights abuses. It will be a paradigm that will be intolerant of social exclusion, of occupation, of any forms of modern apartheid. It will be a paradigm that tries to ensure men and women, young and old, live in social harmony in the kind of future that we all aspire for our children. This is our aspiration, and as I've said, Palestine is seen as a fundamental part of the delivery of that future that we want. Thank you very much.
I thank Ambassador Kamau for his very rich and informative presentation, including putting the issue that we are discussing within the framework of what is going on at the United Nations, especially in the work of the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you again, Ambassador. Next on my list is Mr. Mutasim Elagra, who is a senior economist with the UNCTAD Assistance to the Palestinians Unit. Since 2008, he has been one of the main contributors to UNCTAD's publications on the Palestinian economy. Prior to joining the UN, he taught economics in North America and worked as an economist for Daewoo International in Sudan. Mr. Elagra has co-edited a book on economic and trade policies in Arab countries and has published a number of articles. His subject will be enlarging the Palestinian economic policy space to promote sustainable development and competitiveness and breaking the cycle of aid dependency in the OPT. The floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, first allow me to thank the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People for inviting UNCTAD to participate in this important event. And I would also like to congratulate Ambassador Mansour for the formation of the National Consensus Government. It's a significant step in the right direction that has been welcomed by the United Nations and by the international community at large. And Secretary General of UNCTAD, who was here yesterday, was echoed the international consensus and congratulated the Palestinians for forming the unity government. My presentation will be in three parts. In the first part, I would highlight some of the key macroeconomic indicators, and these indicators paint a grim picture. In the second part, I will explain what are the reasons behind the grim economic situations in the Palestinian territory, and at the end, I will explore whether the Palestinian Authority or the PA can effectively respond to the economic challenges that it faces. I noticed that in 2013, GDP growth was very low. It was 1.5%, anywhere between 1.5% and 2%, which is lower than the rate of growth of population. It means that on average, the Palestinian people in 2013 were poorer than they used to be in 2012, and indeed they are poorer than in 1999. So the last decade and a half have been lost for Palestinian development. The Palestinian people were a bit richer in 1999 than they are today. And that gives you an idea about the trend that has been taking place in Palestine. Also, the budget deficit of the Palestinian Authority has been very high in 2013. It was 12% of GDP, or about $1.3 billion. That means tax revenues of the Palestinian authorities were not enough to cover its expenditures, and the gap has been $1.3 billion. And this is the reason why, the reason behind the phenomenon of aid dependence in Palestine. In a minute, I will explain why the fiscal situation is so bad. The other thing is the unemployment has been 27%. That is indeed very catastrophic. This is extremely high and one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. However, just as bad as it is, the rate of unemployment does not capture the full severity of the problem in Palestine, because together with the high rate of unemployment, wages have been declining, real wages have been declining, they are already low and they are declining, and the duration of unemployment is very, very long. If you are out of work in Palestine, it takes you a very long time to land a job. And the labor force participation is also very low, because people are discouraged. There are no hopes for finding jobs, so they stop searching for jobs, and that is really, really terrible. As a result of these problems, poverty is wide and deep in Palestine. It has been worsening, and about 34% of households are food insecure. Actually, only 1 in 4 households in Palestine are food secure. The rest, or 75% of households, are either food insecure, marginally secure, or vulnerable to food insecurity. So the economic conditions are bad at the macro level and at the level of the average citizen who feels the brunt of these problems. Now I will very quickly go over the reasons behind the underperformance of the Palestinian economy, and I'll say just a few things because I don't have enough time. The first reason behind the underperformance of the economy is the loss of land and natural resources. uh, like the Palestinian people cannot have very restricted access to their lands, water, and natural resources. So that means they cannot, the agricultural sector cannot perform, and even the industrial sector cannot perform, because to build a farm or to build a factory, you need land, and 40% of the land in the West Bank is taken away by settlements and the related infrastructure. So that leaves 60%, and this 60% is not accessible, is not fully accessible to Palestinian investors. And as other reason for the underperformance is the blockade on Gaza. Gaza has been under tight blockade for almost 8 years, and because of that, Gazan producers have been severely constrained. I'll give an example. Fishermen in Gaza have been restricted by Israel to 3 nautical miles of fishing. They cannot go beyond 3 miles. And, but the high value fish exists only beyond 12 miles. In the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian fishers were supposed to be able to access fish within 20 nautical miles, but in practice they have only 3 miles to fish, and there is not much fish in these 3 miles because fish exists beyond 12 miles. The other reason is the agricultural sector in Gaza is also affected by the security buffer established by Israel along the border. And also Gazan producers have no access to imported inputs, because a lot of inputs are not allowed in, because Israel considers them to be dual item use, i.e. items that can potentially be diverted to military use. These things can be fertilizers, can be spare parts, can be anything. So if you don't have access to spare parts, to inputs, you can really not produce that much. The other reason for the underperformance is the construction of the separation barrier. The separation barrier takes away 10% of the most fertile land in the West Bank and renders it inaccessible to Palestinian farmers. The separation barrier is constructed inside Palestinian territories. I mean, if you have a neighbor and you don't like your neighbor, you want to build a wall between you and your neighbor, that can be morally questionable, but it may still be your right. But you have to build it exactly at the border. Building it inside his land is a different thing. So that's why the separation barrier redefines the borders away from the internationally recognized borders at the Green Line, and it acts as a de facto annexation device. So with that, 10% of the most fertile agricultural land in the West Bank is lost. Also, Palestinian producers in the West Bank as well as in Gaza are isolated from global markets. They cannot export, either because they cannot physically export, as is the case in Gaza, or they can export but at a much higher cost, as in the West Bank. And if your cost is high, you'll not be able to compete in global markets, and you're out of business. Not because you're physically capable of exporting, but the cost is so high that you cannot compete. So all the above considerations are the reasons behind the weak gross performance in the Palestinian economy, and these are exactly the roots behind the fiscal crisis and also behind the aid dependence in Palestine. These factors combine to create the fiscal crisis by giving rise to a small tax base. Because you don't have a lot of production, you don't have a lot of employment, so the Palestinian Authority cannot collect enough tax revenue because people are not working and there is not much trade going on. The other thing is that because of the high unemployment rate, there is a huge pressure on the Palestinian Authority to spend on social, for social reasons. It has to help those people who are out of jobs by providing social transfers, by providing anti-poverty programs, by providing health services, and this creates pressure on the Palestinian government, both on the expenditure side and on the revenue side. And the last channel by which the fiscal crisis is deepened is because the private sector cannot produce enough employment opportunities. The Palestinian Authority is forced to act as an employer of last resort and to employ more and more higher and higher percentage of the working population. If I have to summarize the whole situation in one sentence, I would say that occupation is the real reason behind the fiscal crisis and aid dependence in Palestine. Having identified some of the key features of the fiscal crisis, I want to turn to two key fiscal constraints that are faced by the Palestinian Authority. The first one is the frequent withholding of Palestinian revenue by Israel. Because according to the Paris Protocol, all imports to Palestine, whether they're from Israel or from a third country, they come through Israel, and Israel collect taxes on these imports and then transfers the money to the Palestinian Authority. And trade taxes constitute 60 to 70% of Palestinian fiscal revenues. Like about 2/3 of Palestinian fiscal revenue comes from trade taxes, which are collected by Israel, and then Israel takes like 3% as administrative fees and then transfers the rest to the Palestinian Authority. But frequently Israel has been withholding these transfers for any unilateral considerations, usually political considerations. For example, when the Palestinian Authority applied to join the United Nations, Israel withheld the revenue and did not transfer it to the Palestinian Authority, and that created a lot of problems and suffering in Palestine. The government was not able to pay its workforce, and producer could not sell because Palestinian public sector workers did not have enough money, and the Palestinian and these employees of the government could not pay their bank loans. So it created also some sort of instability everywhere in the economy. This was not the first time. Israel has been withholding Palestinian tax revenue since 2002. It usually releases the money after a few months, but the effect is still very destabilizing because it prevents the Palestinian Authority from planning fiscally and properly, and it also creates an atmosphere of uncertainty, and the private sector becomes unsure whether the Palestinian Authority can meet its obligation to it in due time or not. And this is very discouraging to the private sector, and it's also discouraging to investment. The other fiscal problem I would like to highlight here quickly is what we call the leakage of Palestinian fiscal resources to Israel. And as I said, in line with the Paris Protocol, Israel collects the taxes on Palestinian trade and transfers them to the Palestinian Authority. And Israel has a free trade agreement with Palestine, so Palestinian imports to Israel enter Palestinian markets duty-free, but imports from third countries they pay duties. So what happens is there is what we call the phenomena of indirect imports. It works like that. let me fairly say that 39% of Palestinian imports from Israel are not actually from Israel. They are actually from a third country. I mean, Palestinians import about 70% of their imports from Israel. So there is a huge concentration of Palestinian imports with Israel. So what happens is 39% of these supposedly Palestinian imports from Israel are actually not produced in Israel. They are produced in a third country. But they get shipped to Israel, and Israel takes customs duties on them, and it takes taxes on them. But then they get re-exported to Palestine as if they were produced in Israel. So when they enter the Palestinian market, they enter duty-free. So according to the rules of international trade, the taxes on these imports should go to the Palestinian Authority because these are goods that are going to be consumed in Palestine. So that's a key channel of where the Palestinian Authority loses money to Israel. Money that's supposed to be transferred from Israel to Palestinian Authority, it doesn't get transferred. And actually the Bank of Israel issued a report in 2010, that's the Central Bank of Israel in 2010, saying that 39% of Palestinian imports from Israel are actually produced in a third country. So we use that number, or Ted used that number, and we did our calculations, and we found that Palestine loses every year about $150 million. Are supposed to be transferred to the Palestinian authorities. They are not transferred. So that's every year. So this is a key channel of leakage of fiscal resources, and this is also one of the reasons behind the Palestinian fiscal crisis. The other source of revenue leakage from Palestine to Israel is smuggling. We know that because Palestine is under occupation. The Palestinian Authority has no control over its borders whatsoever. So a lot of goods get smuggled from Israel and from Israeli settlements, and they get sold in the Palestinian market. So these goods Israel imposes taxes on these goods, whether it's value-added taxes or whether they're custom duties, and then they enter the Palestinian market, they get consumed by Palestinians, but the revenue goes to Israel when it's supposed to go to Palestine. We estimate that 25 to 35% of imported goods in Palestine are actually smuggled. And as a result of that, the Palestinian treasury loses $190 million every year to smuggling because it has no control over its border. So if we add these two figures, the revenue leakage from indirect imports and from smuggling, we reach as a number of $305 million every year. This is a very, very conservative estimate. There are other channels of revenue leakage from Palestine to Israel. We did not include them in these calculations because we don't have the hard data to back it up. But this is just part of the fiscal leakage, and it's a very significant one. If you think about it, it's really a bizarre situation. It's like Kenyan citizens paying taxes to the Ugandan government and getting nothing in return. So this is the direct financial cost of the fiscal leakage, but there is a wider economic cost. So the wider economic cost is, suppose these leaked resources were available to the Palestinian government. The Palestinian government could invest them to stimulate the economy and to build the infrastructure. We did some calculations and macroeconometric simulation, and we concluded that if these resources were made available to the Palestinian government, GDP growth would be 4% higher every year, and the Palestinian Authority would be able to create 9,000 jobs additionally every year. So this is what I wanted to say about the fiscal leakage. The last part of my presentation will be about whether the Palestinian Authority can respond effectively to the challenges of reviving a war-torn economy. First, let me say that the Palestinian Authority has been extremely successful in building solid institutions in the last 20 years, and these institutions, the quality of these institutions is recognized by the international community. In fact, the United Nations and the World Bank and the IMF certified that the Palestinian Authority has the ability to assume all the functions of a sovereign state, and its institutions compare favorably with other countries in the region and other countries around the world. I have been working with Palestinians for many years, and the quality of their institutions are really impressive. Institutions like the Central Bureau of Statistics or the Palestinian Monetary Authority or the Palestinian Customs Administration. But for these institutions to deliver effective government and governance and make the difference they're capable of making, they need a policy space. And by policy space, here I restrict myself to the economic side of governance. By policy space, I mean the scope and the tools available for policymakers to steer the economy towards achieving its development goals and building a strong economy. In normal countries, economic policymakers use counter-cyclical economic policies, whether they are fiscal or monetary, to smooth out the business cycle. If you have a recession or you have high unemployment, you use expansionary fiscal policy and expansionary monetary policy to reduce unemployment and to stimulate production. And on the other side, if the economy is overheating and you have inflation, you use contractionary monetary and fiscal policies to bring prices under control. You can also use fiscal policy to stimulate and monetary policy to stimulate private and public investment and build your productive capacity. Let me say that the Palestinian Authority, one of the key problems is that the Palestinian Authority has extremely limited policy space. It has extremely limited scope to achieve its economic policy goals. Because it has no independent economic policy space. Why? Okay, take for example trade policy. According to the Paris Protocol, Palestine has to adhere to the Israeli trade policies. Palestine cannot set independent tariff levels, so they have to use the Israeli tariffs. So that means the Palestinian side cannot do much, and this and the other. Okay. And since the Palestinians cannot set independent tariffs and they cannot set independent value-added taxes, it means they also have very limited fiscal policy independence. On the other side, Palestine does not have a currency of its own, and because it does not have a currency of its own, it does not have an independent monetary policy, it does not have an independent interest rate policy, and it does not have an independent exchange rate policy. So it has to use the policies that are adopted by Israel, and these policies are designed by Israel to serve Israeli interests, and the Palestinian economy is so different from the Israeli economy. They are at completely different levels. That's why the Israeli policies are not suitable to be adopted by the Palestinian side, because the level of development in the two economies is just different. The issue of the exchange rate is extremely important, because the exchange rate is one of the most important is one of the most important policy variables in the economy. What happens is, if your exchange rate is too strong, it's really bad for the economy because it wipes out your competitiveness. If the exchange rate is too strong, you cannot compete in export markets because your exports are more expensive. And you cannot compete in domestic markets because imports becomes cheaper and your domestic producers who compete against these imports cannot really do business because the imports are just too cheap. So since the Palestinians are using the Israeli shekels, the shekel is too strong for the Palestinian economy. It wipes out Palestinian competitiveness. It makes Palestinians incapable of exporting as much as they could, and it makes imports flood the Palestinian economy, and domestic producers cannot compete with cheap imported goods. Just to give you a feel for the importance of the exchange rate is look at what is happening now in Greece and Spain. They have very, very high unemployment. Why? Because the euro is just too strong for them. They are not as developed as the rest of Europe. So in the last many years, inflation has been a little bit higher in Greece and Spain, and productivity growth has been a little bit slower than the rest of Europe, especially compared to Germany. And as a result, you have a very huge unemployment problem in these economies. If they had an independent currency, they would have just devalued the currency. They have allowed the exchange rate to go a little bit down, and that will solve the unemployment problem. But since they don't have independence in that sphere, they have been suffering, and they have been suffering heavily. On the other hand, if you look at China, the Chinese miracle, a big part of it is because China has maintained an undervalued exchange rate for a very long period of time, and that helped Chinese exporters to dominate the world. What is happening in Palestine is being forced to do China in reverse. They're using a currency that is just too strong for them. Just conclude in the interest of time by saying that the policy space available for the Palestinian government is extremely limited, and the Palestinian Authority is like a driver who is given a car with flat tires and no wheel and asked to go ahead. And despite all these challenges, Palestinian government has been doing its very, very best, and the quality of economic management is very high. What it needs is more sovereignty and independence to be able to revive the economy. Thank you.
I thank Mr. El Agra for sharing with us his thoughts. The Palestinians have been caught up in a vicious cycle whereby the occupation stifles their economy, forcing them into aid dependency, which in turn constrains their policy options for confronting the occupation. While a comprehensive political settlement leading to the end of the Israeli occupation seems as elusive as ever, there are some things the Palestinians can do here and now to enlarge economic space. Our committee will surely take on board your idea, sir. Next on our list is Mr. Itai Epstein, representing the Association of International Development Agencies, IDEA. The association is an umbrella organization of over 80 international aid and development agencies active in OPT. He is legal coordinator for Action Against Hunger, ACF International OPT mission, and has been active with numerous NGOs. The subject of his presentations is going to be resilience, attrition, erosion, operational and normative challenges to mobilizing, coordinating, and delivering humanitarian assistance in a coercive environment. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mine is a precarious position being the last speaker in the last panel, so let me take this opportunity to extend gratitude applause commands to your tenacious resolve, those who are with us this afternoon. Of course, take this opportunity to extend Ada's gratitude for extending an invitation to partake in this seminar. As the chair has generously suggested, I would look at both the operational and normative challenges in delivering humanitarian aid in two distinct areas of operation for our agencies, the West Bank and Gaza. What they do have in common are administrative and physical restriction and a humanitarian space in terms of access to our beneficiaries, in terms of our ability to conduct our operations, that is increasingly shrinking. In fact, access to Gaza and to vast expanses of Area C of the West Bank is at an all-time low. That is the reason behind Ada's focus and efforts on bringing members together to share, strategize best practices to ensure that we can effectively deliver both humanitarian relief and development assistance and reach the people most in need. We have focused our collaborative efforts on policy change that will support that timely, unimpeded delivery of aid. Very broadly, within Area C, we face the planning and permit regime imposed by Israel, and I will go into the merits of that regime. In Gaza, we have restrictions of the free movement and access both of people and of goods in and out of the Gaza Strip. Allow me to focus first on Area C of the West Bank, and I think I'll try and hinge some of the analysis on food security, access to livelihood, viable livelihood, and access to water and sanitation. The Israeli planning and permit regime has been identified by Ada members as the root cause for humanitarian needs in Area C of the occupied West Bank, impeding Palestinians' ability to realize their rights to water, to adequate shelter, to education, health, and to livelihood. It also represents a transgression into local legislation and the disenfranchisement of Palestinians from planning institutions, from planning procedures. In effect, it is the Israeli military commander that plans for Palestinians in occupied territory. Palestinians are utterly disenfranchised, removed from planning institutions and processes. That is not the case for settlers, who are in fact included in the and represented in the planning institutions imposed by the military commander. Neither is the planning and permit regime effective. In the last 20 years, 94% of Palestinian permit applications have been rejected by the military commander, thus preventing communities and individuals from developing adequate housing, schools, hospitals, health clinics, water networks, electricity grids. So we're talking about residents, livelihood-related structure, but also community assets that are denied the opportunity to be lawfully constructed. Any attempt at construction is met with without a permit that is almost unattainable, is met with stop work and demolition orders, consequently with the destruction of property which affects both residents, livelihood-related, and community assets, as I've already suggested. As part of the planning and permit regime, less than 1% of Area C has been assigned for Palestinian developed by the Israeli military commander. We should note that most of it is already built up. So in terms of a land reserve, in terms of an agricultural hinterland, there's not much left for Palestinians to develop, even if they had been issued with permits. This all comes at a cost. And estimates vary. For 2010, we are talking about an excess of $4 billion in estimated cost of Israeli restrictions in Area C alone, which represents roughly 50% of Palestinian GDP. Of course, and I'm no economist, but I think this echoes or reflects what has been said by those who are far more adept at this than I am, that this translates into an increase in production costs because you are prevented access to productive land, because there's temperance, interference with viable livelihood. So whatever it is produced comes at an added cost, which of course will translate into a diminished purchasing power for communities and individuals alike. There's simply less of a free income to go around, which for us will, of course, immediately impact on individuals and communities' food security, rather insecurity or vulnerability to food insecurity. Roughly 30% of the population in Area C of the West Bank are either food insecure or vulnerable to food insecurity. That is further compounded by the restricted access to water and sanitation. 492 communities in the West Bank access or consume water significantly below the World Health Organization recommended consumption level. And let me be very clear. This is not about water scarcity. This is about water disparity. So there's an abundance of water. It's the distribution between the settlements built in contravention of international law and Palestinian community. It is water disparity and not scarcity. On top of that, 313 individuals, which is the majority of Palestinians residing in Area C of the West Bank, are not connected to the water grid, nor are they connected to a sewage grid, which means they have to transport water both for domestic and livelihood-related use. That all comes at an added cost and impedes their livelihood, as I'm sure you understand. Now, it is not only food security, access to livelihood, water, and sanitation, because what further compounds the humanitarian situation for Palestinians residing in Area C are the practices and policies of the occupying power. And I think at times we lose sight of the fact that we are not, as humanitarian and development actors, countering some force majeure. This is not a force of nature that has interfered with the life of Palestinians. These are the actions, the policies, the practices of the occupying power, namely the wanton destruction of property and the imminent risk of forcible transfer. Just to give you kind of a rough figures, again, this was, I think, echoed by some of my colleagues in former presentations. Between January of 2009 and May of 2014, close to 3,000 properties owned and inhabited by Palestinians were destroyed in Area C in East Jerusalem in contravention of international law, which prohibits the destruction of civilian objects. That has resulted in 5,500 Palestinians affected. When I say affected, it's either their residence that has been destroyed or their livelihood adversely affected. In the same time period, close to 5,000 tenders were issued for settlement units. That translates into homes for 55,000 additional settlers to be housed in Area C of the West Bank. So what we're seeing, and this is a map courtesy of OCHA, I know it's fairly hard to decipher, but what this map demonstrates is the causal link between the destruction of property and the establishment and expansion of settlements. They are the two sides of the same coin. These violations work hand in hand to facilitate the forcible transfer of Palestinians from their land and their communities so that settlements could be established and expanded. I think I should note this is not just a built-up area of settlements, but it is also agricultural activities, agribusiness of settlements, which is now featured predominantly as a means of settlement expansion. What the map shows you the blue spots are incidents of destruction of property. They are also, or they are exclusively in conjunction or adjacent to the expansion of areas that have been designated for settlement expansion. So it's not just a statistical link between tenders, destruction of property, the risk of forcible transfer. There's a causal link between the two. Speaking of the risk of forcible transfer, currently, this is as of this afternoon, there are 2,300 Palestinian Bedouins, herders in the Jerusalem periphery that have been designated by Israel for forcible transfer, and I'll relate to that in a minute. More broadly, 86 Palestinian communities living across the West Bank Area C, living in or adjacent to Israeli declared closed military zone or nature reserves, are destined for forcible transfer, including 1,300 people in the South Hebron Hills in military zone or fire zone 918 in the Masafir Yatta area. What they all have in common, these are people whose transfer within or outside occupied territory is prohibited by international law. In fact, if they are in fact transferred, that will amount to forcible transfer, which is a grave breach of international humanitarian law codified as a war crime. Israel relates to those as relocation plans and not as to forcible transfer. One example, as I've already indicated, is in the Jerusalem periphery. Some of you may be familiar with the E1, East 1 plan to create territorial contiguity between the settlement of Ma'ale Adumim, second largest settlement, and the settlements surrounding in East Jerusalem, Givat Ze'ev, and others. These communities have been designated for forcible transfer to 3 sites within Area B and A under the control of the Palestinian Authority in Jabal, in Nuaima, and in Fasayan. And the notion is not just one of forcible transfer, but this is one of forced urbanization. So these communities, herding communities, pastoral communities, will be forcefully transferred and forcefully urbanized. The other hotspot for forcible transfer are the 8 communities in the Masafir Yatta area. These communities are destined to be forcibly transferred into the town of Yatta because the area has been declared as a closed military zone where live fire exercise is undertaken by Israeli forces. But there's the day after, and the Israeli government has already indicated that following their forcible transfer, this will not be maintained as a closed military zone. Rather, adjacent settlement will expand into the area and new settlements will be established. So this area is certainly fit for residents, but it's simply not fit for Palestinian residents. Now, there's a backdrop to all this. This is not just us trying to capture the humanitarian situation. There's a political context to this. The map you see in front of you, I've taken off the website of an Israeli parliament, the Knesset caucus. We're an all-party group on the pacification of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the annexation of Area C. I know it's a long name for a parliamentary caucus. The caucus is chaired by Minister of Trade Naftali Bennett, and what they have suggested, and this is the program, the political program comes with a map, is the formal annexation of Area C of the West Bank. I know it's hard to tell, but if you could read the key of this map, it has Area A and B in the 2 shades of brown, but doesn't have Area C in the key of the map. Rather, 62% of the West Bank, which correspond to Area C as we know it today, the key of the map says full Israeli control, as in formal annexation, which would amount to acquisition of territory by force of war, but it is modeled after the unilateral, unlawful annexation of East Jerusalem. So this is the political program that informs actions, policies, and practices. Recently, they have become, the Israeli forces, Israeli military commander has become very innovative in tackling or interfering with humanitarian aid. This is a picture I took just a few weeks ago in Jabal al-Baba in the Jerusalem periphery. You're seeing a subcontractor for the Israeli military commander dismantling human shelter residence provided by the European Union and the French consulate, by ECHO and the French consulate. The reason they are being dismantled is because military commander used to issue stop work and demolition orders that could be contested in the Israeli High Court, which buys you time. There's adjudication of the case, and in the meantime, the humanitarian assets remain in the community. They have changed tactics. Now they're issuing these structures with seizure of goods orders. But in order to be able to seize them as goods, they have to be dismantled. So once they're dismantled, they're no longer structures that can be issued with demolition orders. They're simply construction materials that could be seized. So upon dismantling, they are removed. Consequently, that could only be challenged in the court post factum, after the humanitarian asset, the residence, has been removed from the community. The other element is prioritizing the destruction of humanitarian aid delivered by INGOs, provided by the international community. In this case, in the South Hebron Hills, you see mobile latrines, again provided by ECHO, delivered by ACF. The remaining structures in this community, in the hamlet of Jinba, remain standing. And it has been indicated to community members that the Israeli military commander will only destroy those objects that were delivered as humanitarian aid and funded by the European Union, because they wish to erode the humanitarian investment by EU and EU member states. Recently, we have become privy to minutes of a Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. It met to discuss the methods to regulate the Palestinian population in Area C and to ensure enforcement of Israeli military commander enactments regarding unlicensed building or building without an Israeli issued permit. The minutes of the meeting that were leaked reveal a deliberate strategy to prevent, and I quote, the pipeline, the money, and the resources of international organizations working to assist Palestinians in Area C, and contain an official strategy of aid confiscation and demolition. Methods suggested include denial or revocation of work visas for international staff, access restrictions and the denial of permits for local Palestinian staff, arrest and detention of humanitarian workers, and the subsequent criminalization of both INGOs and their donors. Speaking of interference with humanitarian aid, this shows you the breakdown of affected donor aid for ACF alone, one of several agencies providing humanitarian aid. In the last 3 years, we had 187 shelter and livelihood structures, 66 water sanitation, which includes mobile latrines, rainwater cisterns, water capacity storage tanks, and 8 community assets, including schools, kindergartens, and health clinics, affected by either stop work, demolition order, or seizure orders, or the execution of any of these orders. This all comes at a cost. So the estimated, and again, this is for ACF alone, the estimated financial risk is 1.256 million euros. Not all of it has been realized. Roughly 20% have been either seized or destroyed, but that remains, the remaining 80% remains to be affected or protected. Certainly, taking a wider angle on this, the impact on ADA members is calculated annually as $4.5 million through interference with humanitarian aid, and I'm I regret to say that 40% of our members have reported abandoning programs due to access restrictions and interference with humanitarian aid because they hold that the humanitarian investment cannot be protected. It is not sustainable, where it is constantly being tempered, destroyed, seized, and so on. Again, let me note that we have taken extraordinary measures to protect the humanitarian investment. What you see here is a school that we have constructed with European Union funding in the hamlet of Jinba in the South Harban Hills within a fire zone, a declared fire zone. And you can see the European flag flying high on this school. This is not a definitive measure in the sense that it does not stop the military commander and his bulldozers in their tracks, but it's one other element of protection and of political attachment by our donors to the humanitarian investment, to the humanitarian aid. Another thing that I will note very quickly is the exhaustion of domestic remedies. Some of you may know the Palestinians enjoy standing in the Israeli High Court of Justice, which has jurisdiction, supervision, judicial supervision or jurisdiction over the military commander. And to some extent, Palestinians enjoy procedural guarantees in the High Court. So they are allowed their day in court. But having analyzed 47 years of case law, what you find that beyond procedural guarantees, there are no effective remedies in the Israeli High Court of Justice. There's no precedence where the court rules in favor of Palestinians. In fact, the court does not intervene in the substantive judgment of the military commander. It has made it very clear that it will not transplant the judgment of the military commander when it comes to regulating or administering occupied territory, including the issuance or denial of permits and the issuance of stop work demolition orders and their execution. In fact, the court has identified the fact that we, as the humanitarian community, have used legal aid and adjudication as a means of buffering the impact of military commander policies and practices, and now is moving towards rejecting in limine these petitions. So I think the window of opportunity in terms of utilizing domestic remedies or exhausting domestic remedy is rapidly closing. Again, moving on to Gaza, and with that I will conclude before I come to some recommendations. And these are figures you have seen before. IMF poverty index put Gaza at 26% of the population living under the poverty line, 13% living in extreme poverty. I think we would have seen far more dramatic numbers if it wasn't for the fact that 80% of Gazans are recipients of aid. They are aid dependent, and even with that, 57% of the population is food insecure or vulnerable to food insecurity. So even our ability to mitigate some of the impact in terms of food security livelihood is limited. Again, the reasons have, I think, been outlined during this seminar, both in terms of access to productive land and access to productive fisheries, the free flow or the flow of energy, both in terms of electricity, fuel, and gas, restrictions on the movement of goods in and out of Gaza. Consequently, 35% of productive land is prohibited from access, 6,500 unemployed fishermen, which of course the impediments, the restrictions on exports from Gaza, predominantly to the West Bank and to Israel. That being said, let me conclude with a few recommendations that we would wish those in attendance to take on board. First of all, I think we need to reiterate that Israel, as the occupying power, has the primary obligation to provide for the welfare, well-being, the needs of the Palestinian population. If they are unwilling or unable to do so, they have a secondary obligation, which is to facilitate the rapid, unimpeded delivery of aid. Israel is in fact entitled to a measure of control over the delivery of aid. However, and I think it's worth noting, aid cannot be denied, prevented, or disrupted on arbitrary grounds. In fact, Article 59 of the Four Geneva Conventions clearly stated the occupying power must allow for humanitarian relief. If they have any security grounds to object, the onus is on them to substantiate those security grounds. That being said, repeated seizure and destruction of emergency shelter, as well as threats, duress, psychological oppression, and violence, all come together to form a coercive environment that could lead to forcible transfer. As I've already noted, forcible transfer of the protected population is a grave breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention, codified as a war crime. And third state in that relation have an obligation to prevent forcible transfer. International donors should support emergency shelter projects, water projects, livelihood projects to help meet the immediate needs and provide a protective element against forcible transfer, ensuring the Palestinian people can remain on their land in their communities. Donors in third states further should hold Israel accountable for violations, including the destruction of aid funded by the international community. The destruction of humanitarian assistance, as you've seen just with ACF figures, is a significant resource deficit for the EU and EU member states. And what we would like to see is a systematic approach to reclaiming this debt as a first step to ensuring effective remedy, not just for the donors, but for the communities that they are working to support. Finally, on Gaza, the land, air, and sea restrictions imposed by Israel must be lifted. Israel is the occupying power. Gaza remains occupied. It is in contravention, these policies, practices, and restriction are in contravention of Israel's obligations under international humanitarian law. We must allow safe passage to and from Gaza and to the West Bank. Those must be open for the free movement of people and goods. And finally, and I think this relates to some of the issues previously discussed, occupied Palestinian territory must be considered as one entity under international law, and the international community should take the opportunity of a unity Palestinian government to press for full social, economic, and political integration of Gaza and the West Bank. I thank you all for your patience.
Thank you very much, Mr. Epstein. Our committee is aware that your noble work of delivering assistance in the situation of military occupation is fraught with many challenges. All too often, the humanitarian access is impeded, aid confiscated, and vital projects built with international aid money destroyed by the Israeli military, especially in the Area C, and visas for humanitarian workers denied. International humanitarian actors need the full pressure of the political echelons to help them overcome Israeli obstacles to their vital work in the OPT. Colleagues, I think we are now entering our discussion with the question and answer, and allow me to abuse my position to ask a question to each of the presenters. First, to Mr. Kamau, in your presentation you have identified 4 primary issues or goals which are very important, especially related to the situation in Palestine now. I'm just wondering why you didn't mention the goal 16, which is, I do believe this is very important, equally important with regard to peaceful and inclusive society, access to justice for all, and effective and capable institution. That's my first question to Mr. Kamau. And my second question to Mr. Alagra. I'm just wondering, being not an economist, why the Palestinians have not issued their own currency. What would be the obstacles of issues be to doing so? What are the challenges? What are the difficulties? Why? And my last question to Mr. Epstein. I'm just wondering if there is any differences in terms of characters and sources of aid if you compare between Gaza and West Bank. With this, I would like to open the floor for a question from, yes, the first is from Mr. Abu Saimeh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I'm not going to answer your question regarding the currency, but I have very small comments in order to follow what Mr. Mu'tasim mentioned regarding the issue of inflation. Actually, this is very dangerous things in Palestine, and till now, unfortunately, nobody highlighted and nobody talk about it, and there is no research in terms of these issues. The story is like that in brief. In the year 2003, there was very famous story regarding the Israeli inflation, because it was the first time in Israel life they had negative inflation, which was about minus 1.9. Unfortunately, in the same time, the Palestinians, they had inflation more than 1.6. That means that even we are using the same currencies, but Palestinian and Israelis, two economies, and both of them affected in different way from the currency. Actually, what's going on, Israel is exporting its inflation to the Palestinian territory by using the Palestinian bank and sending their currencies to the Palestinian bank. All the economists know that the country should use physical and monetary currency in order to control the exchange rate of its currency. So Israel actually is using West Bank and Gaza, and the banks in West Bank and Gaza of flooding its money inside it by refusing getting the money from the Palestinian banks and sending to Israel, or sometimes sending some Israeli shekel from Israel to the West Bank and Gaza. I think this is affecting the Palestinian economy too much, and I think that we need a comprehensive research in terms of this inflation in order to assess our losses also from using of the Israeli shekels. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Would anyone like to take the floor? Ambassador Mansour? I know it. Please.
Thank you very much. I just want to say thank you to the three presenters who have added, different dimensions to looking at the situation of the Palestinian people under occupation. And of course, these different prisms, or looking at it differently, is adding to the collective thorough exposition of the reality of the Palestinian people under the conditions living under occupation. Now, of course, one can raise so many questions with regard of how we can do things differently, but also there are so many restrictions imposed on us that we cannot be free to deal with all the things that we want. One of them is the currency issue. It is not it's not a matter of decision for us to make that we say that we want to have currency and then the following day we will be printing Palestinian currency. You have always to look at the huge involvement of occupation in so many different aspects of our decisions and our life, and one of them is that although we did some research, we did some preparation in this regard, but it is not yet available to us. In fact, I saw so many models of currency for us, to use. So in terms of the abstract preparation or readiness, we are there, but it is not that simple. And for that matter, even having full passports, because our traveling documents, although in Arabic it says passports, and in English it says passport VIP, which is more or less, it's like a traveling document for Palestinians who live, let's say, in Lebanon and in Syria. They have a similar thing, which is a traveling document. And in addition to that, no passport will be issued without having a national number by the Israelis, and the Israelis would have a record of all these details with regard to passports. So if we have Palestinians who do not have residency card in the occupied territory, and here I'm excluding East Jerusalemite, because they don't have that, they have Jordanian passports, then you will not be able to have a Palestinian passport. And if we manage to print passports for them, we use fictitious numbers that are not available to the Israelis, and you cannot be able to use them to cross the, let's say, the bridge and to go to Palestine. You might be able to use them in visiting, different countries that have recognized the state of Palestine, and they are not savvy or sensitive to the differentiation between those who have numbers that the Israelis have and those who do not have such numbers. I'm just saying these things, just to illustrate additional issues related to the complexity of our situation. And in terms of inflation and also increases of added tax value, according to the Paris Agreement, which is not fair to us, we are not allowed to lag behind Israel by more than 2%. So if they decide to increase the added taxes value to 17%, we are not allowed to descend to more than 15%. For our economy, this is too much, to add to the people in terms of added tax value, but we are not allowed to, let's say, to drop it to 10% or to 9%. And as I said, it is unfair, in the Paris Protocol and the economic relationship between us and them, that there is such stipulation, which many of our economists and officials are demanding revising, that agreement, and we cannot tie our economy with the Israeli economy. When our per capita income is roughly about $2,000, and their per capita income is in the vicinity of $30-some thousand, and yet, to impose similar taxation codes in our economies, while maybe their economy and the income of their people can be accommodating for such high taxation on the added value taxation, but our income does not justify such an increase. I did not hear any one of you talking about that element, but I am just putting it on the table since we deal with things in a very transparent way. Everything is on the table, everything is under discussion, everyone under the sun is involved in our situation. We welcome that. We are not ashamed of anything, and we want your contribution, and we appreciate the help of all of you. Those who want to have more aid, we appreciate that, and the donor countries. And UNCTAD, who is trying to do things and advise us, we appreciate that. And also, my friend, the Ambassador Kamau is holding a very prestigious post as a co-chair of the SDG, which is a lofty exercise and objectives that we are trying collectively to decide on, and we play our humble role in trying to be as part of humanity in articulating these objectives. And in this connection, we are now joining so many conventions. He highlighted some of the objectives of the SDGs. I just want only to deal with one issue that is of extreme importance to us. It is extreme important to humanity. In fact, I think that this is becoming the biggest issue debated at the United Nations, and it will be debated for many years to come. Issues related to climate change, which is affecting all of us, and we are part of this humanity, and we are involved in this process. And in fact, the conventions of climate change are becoming the biggest conventions organized by the United Nations. Even they are bigger than Rio Plus 20, although it is a derivative of Rio Conference and Rio Plus 20. And we are closely studying joining, the convention as a state party. We know the obstacles before us, those who are polluting the most and who's supposed to pay the most for the cleaning, the $100 billion which we all are demanding from those who are polluting to pay it annually to deal with the mitigation and adaptation. especially the African country, which is affected in a huge way, desertification aspect, food security, the huge increase of food in South Africa, in the African continent, and also the 45 island countries who are extremely afraid of the rise of water if the temperature to go above 2%, and then they are afraid of drowning. Now, I attended 4 of these conferences, and I will attend more, including the summit in September in New York. Of course, we want to be involved. We are part of humanity. We contribute as much as we can, particularly in the group of 77 on China. But we don't want to add to the complexity of things. We often sacrifice for the common good, as we are seriously debating not to exercise our right in joining FAO and the World Health Organization. And precisely the reasons why we are seriously considering not to join, because the Americans pay for each one of these 2 agencies $500 million annually. And we don't want to hurt our friends who voted for the change of our status to an observer state. We act responsibly, we know what we're doing, we research thoroughly all these things. And if we are going to continue sacrificing, not joining the climate change convention and staying on the side as an observer state, it would be simply because we will continue to sacrifice for the common good. We will support all the efforts for the $100 billion annually for the need of Africa and the island countries and all those who are suffering immensely from those who are polluting and creating this problem for all of us and for humanity and for Earth. But that does not mean we are not an active player on the margins. We will continue to do that, and we will contribute to doing that. The Americans know very well that if we become a state party to the climate change convention, we will be a very active and influential player. And then if that is to happen, and if they stay in the convention and in the meetings, they might be lobbying us immensely for our help. But these things we are not there yet, but we are doing what we can on the margin. Mr. Chairman, you asked me for my contribution. This is, part of my contribution to the discussion of my friends and to the presenters. Our story and our saga is, no matter how you look at it, it is like opening Pandora's box. Now, when I do my concluding remarks, I don't want people to leave with negative feelings. We're dealing with facts, but we don't lose hope. And we give you these facts so that you will be better informed about our reality, so that you can be a stronger fighters for justice and for what needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Is there anyone wishing to take the floor at this stage? I see none. Then I would like to invite the speakers, distinguished speakers, to respond to my question and also with your concluding remarks. Ambassador Kamau, you may start.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Very quickly, if I may. The point I was basically trying to make is that it's very, very difficult to imagine Palestine being a beneficiary of the Sustainable Development Goals. So you can pick any of these goals. Is it really possible under colonial occupation and enforcement of quasi-apartheid regimes, as have been described here by many, to end poverty in Palestine? It's not possible. Is it possible to end hunger, improve malnutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture? It's not possible. Is it possible to attain healthy lives for all? It's not possible. You can go down the whole list. None of these goals are attainable under the current paradigm. It doesn't matter what aid you give to Palestine. It doesn't matter what kind of roles you begin to come up for donors, for Palestine's diaspora. They can send as much money as they want. it will not change the fundamentals of life in Palestine. It'll be difficult to break the dependency cycle, either on the aid or on diaspora or on the occupying power, when the fundamentals are so fundamentally out of whack with reality. So I didn't go into these specifics because I wanted to make the point that the paradigm, since I was asked to speak about this new aid paradigm, the kind of paradigm that we envision for the future under the Sustainable Development Goals, first of all, is not an aid paradigm. Aid is only a small part of it. It is fundamentally a paradigm that's driven by domestic resources, by South-South cooperation, North-South cooperation, triangular cooperation. And none of those options are available to Palestine. So even if we do get into this debate, it is an unreal debate for those who are living in the conditions that prevail in Palestine, because they have no access to these opportunities. I emphasize the fact that the new paradigm, the new Sustainable Development Goals are looking to eradicate poverty. As I said, you can't do it under the current conditions. You can't even have, whether it's managing inflation, raising domestic resources, you can't do that. Controlling your currency, nothing. There's no fiscal policy, there's no monetary policy. There's nothing in Palestine. So how are you going to do this? There's no industrial policy. There's just nothing. Everything that's in the new Sustainable Development Goal set does not avail itself to the situation in Palestine. How do you heal the earth in Palestine? That's the second thing I said. Yesterday we had a very good description of the damage, the environmental damage that's happened because of the concentration of people on small pieces of land, the destruction of trees and so on and so forth. How do you do it? You cannot turn this situation around under those circumstances. The third thing I said was social harmony and inclusion. How is it possible? How can you have social harmony when you are under attack? How do you have social harmony when your families are being disrupted, destroyed? When walls are being put through your villages? Where's the social harmony? Where's the social inclusion in all of this? And lastly, I said that for this to work, we're aspiring for economic prosperity. Everything we've heard is about economic implosion, not prosperity. It's about the destruction of people's wealth, of people's livelihoods. So without democracy, without liberty, without freedom, without the decolonization of Palestine, without the removal of the occupying power, without the evisceration of the apartheid structures, it'll never happen. So this needs to, you've got to put the cart before the horse. In this case, we put the cart before the horse. You've got to get the horse in the right place to pull, the cart of progress so that change truly comes. So, I could have spoke about peace and inclusive societies, which is the one, number 16, but it would have been an academic conversation because the circumstances on the ground do not avail themselves to the uptake of these goals. It's a tragic situation, but it's a real situation, and that's what we have to face. That is why, as I said, peace must come, colonialism must end, occupation must end, and the apartheid in that regime, in that part of the world must come to an end first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for a very convincing response, and congratulations again for your success in co-chairing the Open Working Group on SDGs. Mr. Alagra?
Regarding the currency, the most important aspect of having a new currency is that people should have confidence in that currency, and people should be willing to use that currency to save their wealth in terms of it. Under current circumstances, this confidence is impossible to attain because Palestinians are very vulnerable to occupation, economically vulnerable and politically vulnerable to occupation. And under these circumstances, even if they issue a currency now, nobody will have confidence in that currency, nobody will want to hold it. So the political conditions are not right for having an independent currency. So that's a confidence argument. The other aspects of having a currency is that the country should have solid skills in its central bank, or in the case of Palestine, in the Palestinian Monetary Authority. You need really good economists who know how to use monetary policy to control prices, to target interest rates, to stimulate the economy, to achieve full employment. And this technical skill is, the genesis or the roots of that technical skill is available, but it needs some upgrading, and that is doable. That's the easy part, but the confidence part is the hard one. The other thing is that you need your central bank or your monetary authority should be independent, should be autonomous of the government, so that the government should not be able to use the currency to just print currency to finance itself, because if the government abuses the currency to fund itself, it can only give you runaway inflation, and that can destroy the economy. So you need an institutional capacity, you need regulations, you need laws that guarantee that the central bank is autonomous of the government. And this the Palestinians understand very well, and they're capable of doing it. So right now, the Palestinian cannot have a currency, and they should not have a currency. We raise the issue of the currency for just to show how using the Israeli currency is very detrimental to economic development in Palestine. It's very costly to the Palestinian economy. We need to understand that cost, and we need to understand how to offset that cost. And in fact, UNCTAD, in one of its studies and in some of its reports, make concrete recommendations for how to offset the cost of using the Israeli currency without issuing a Palestinian currency. We understand the cost and understand how to offset it. That's extremely important. And the other thing is also, what is important is that the Palestinian Monetary Authority should start to build the capacity of managing an independent currency, so that when the time is right, the capacities are there and they're ready to fly. I will end with a note of optimism, not regarding the current thing, but regarding the whole situation. I will just repeat what Nelson Mandela said: it always seems impossible until it is done.
Thank you very much. Mr. Epstein?
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Ambassador Mansour stressed hope. So let me be very clear. Humanitarian relief is a stopgap measure. It is imperative, but it is not definitive. In the sense that it allows the space for future, and I stress future, development. In and of itself, it is not development. It does not afford hope. It simply provides a space where you can cultivate hope. That being said, I would not want to speculate what would it look like, what would happen if humanitarian aid to occupied Palestinian territory and to the Palestinian population is further disrupted with, it's interfered with, it's cut short. I think we can all agree that the impact will be detrimental. On your question, Chair, there's divergence between donors as there is divergence between their recipients, the implementing agency. Let me try and stress two areas of concern in relation to donor funding and streams. And I'm not sure I'll be able to answer, because your original question was, can I identify different sources of aid or patterns, trends within the sources of aid? I'm not sure in a position to name donors, but I would say this, two areas of concern. One, donors funding humanitarian aid in Gaza some of them have introduced comprehensive counterterrorism legislation as caveats, preconditions to funding humanitarian aid. That has put some of the humanitarian agencies, implementing agencies, in a precarious position. When we are asked to provide donors with a level of information that would expose our beneficiaries as individuals, their communities, our national staff. Again, there's divergence there. Some donors have not introduced that type of, shall I say, intrusive counterterrorism legislation. Some have. Some of the recipients' humanitarian agencies have stood fast in not accepting funding that is contingent on that type of compliance with counterterrorism legislation, where we find it to be intrusive on the level of our beneficiaries. Some have complied. I'm not in a position to advise either way, but let me just clarify. I think for all of us, the national unity government is a possible exit strategy from that precarious situation where we either decline funding or we are forced into compliance with this type of legislation and regulation. Speaking for ACF, it's been our long-standing position not to accept funding where there is a contingency on exposing our beneficiaries as part of counterterrorism scrutiny or screening. Furthermore, we have worked with municipalities in Gaza. Some donors consider the municipalities of Gaza part and parcel with the de facto regime or de facto government of Hamas, and therefore some donors have excluded any type of project that is done in cooperation with municipalities. Again, speaking for ACF, and I think we've heard these presentations throughout this seminar on the value or the added value of working with local government, with municipal government. I think it certainly undermines your operations if you're not able to work with local government, municipal governments. So that is on Gaza. In relation to Area C of the West Bank, again, there is divergence with donors. Some have adhered to the position that no prior coordination with the Israeli military commander should be undertaken, neither seeking verbal permission for the delivery of humanitarian relief or permits in essence formal written permission. Let me just say that position echoes not just donors, but that of the UN humanitarian coordinator and the humanitarian country team, which includes INGOs and UN agencies. Humanitarian country team members consider that the current system of prior coordination, as I said, both verbally in written form from the Israeli authorities, as a prerequisite, as a requirement to access our beneficiaries in Area C, fails to effectively facilitate rapid, unimpeded, and impartial provision of humanitarian assistance. Therefore, it is the position of the humanitarian coordinator that members will not generally apply for such prior coordination or permits, and HCT members will assist to systematically protest in the strongest terms and using multiple channels the destruction of humanitarian assistance and equipment pursuant to no prior coordination. And we have repeatedly, from the humanitarian coordinator through UN agency, heads of agencies to country director of INGOs, we have pressed upon Israeli authority to provide reparations, including compensation for assistance and relief items that have been destroyed, and to put in place a coordination mechanism that is effective and is lawful. That being said, not all donors are on board. Some have supported us and the humanitarian country team in taking that position. Some have conceded to the requirement of the Israeli military commander for the issuance of permits. Predominantly in that case, they will not continue to fund operations in Area C, which is of grave concern, because if your alternatives are either coordination with a mechanism that is ineffective and represents a transgression into local legislation, or not providing at all. I think these are all poor, dismal prospects. They present dismal prospects and dismal options. But it is in fact the case that some donors have now suspended or stopped altogether operations in Area C, and we are finding it increasingly difficult to find funding for humanitarian operations that are in high demand and growing demand in response to actions, policies, practices of the military commander in Area C. The one other added element, and with that I will conclude, is that even current donors in Area C have come under scrutiny and criticism because their own taxpayers wish the humanitarian investment to be safeguarded. They want to have assurances that the investment will not be interfered with. I think they are finding it increasingly difficult to rationalize the replacement, rehabilitation, continuation of delivery of humanitarian relief that is being constantly tempered by Israeli authorities. So even the donors that have stood fast in providing in Area C are coming under increased difficulty. I think this is a good opportunity to address this to those present here today. Donors already active in Area C and in Gaza need your political backing and support. Those who are able to direct funding through humanitarian relief and development aid to Area C and Gaza are certainly encouraged to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Absin. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our plenary 3 deliberations. On behalf of the committee, I would like to express our deep appreciation to the distinguished experts, speakers, and all other participants for the valuable contribution. We will resume with the closing sessions at 5:15 or 5:15, and the meeting is adjourned.